For nearly a decade, webtoons have been treated as the Korean entertainment industry's most dependable creative resource, not because they guarantee quality, but because they promise predictability, measurable readership, genre clarity, and audience engagement that can be tracked long before a single camera starts rolling. That logic made sense when the market was smaller, competition was limited, and adaptation itself still felt novel. But in 2025, as webtoon-based films and series began to dominate cinemas and streaming platforms alike, the industry ran into a more complicated reality. Familiarity no longer translates into impact. What this year revealed wasn't that webtoons lost value. It was that they lost their immunity. Owning a popular title was no longer enough to protect a project from structural flaws, tonal misjudgments, or format mismatch, and as a result, the gap between breakout successes and high-profile disappointments became impossible to ignore. The clearest successes of 2025 did not come from scale or spectacle, but from restraint, from creators who understood that adaptation is less about reproducing panels and more about identifying what made the original work resonate emotionally, then rebuilding around that core for a different medium. My Daughter is a Zombie became the most telling example of this approach. Rather than attempting to translate every tonal shift or narrative detail from the original webtoon, the film anchored itself to a single, universally legible relationship, allowing humor and horror to emerge naturally from the emotional tension between a father and his daughter. That choice mattered, because fidelity to emotion proved far more valuable than fidelity to structure. The film didn't just satisfy existing fans, it expanded beyond them, which is where most adaptations either succeed or quietly collapse. Streaming platforms reinforced the same lesson. Netflix's The Trauma Code, Heroes on Call, worked not because it was exhaustively accurate to its source material, but because it preserved what mattered most: urgency, realism, and moral pressure, elements that translate more effectively across cultures than strict narrative loyalty ever could. By leaning into medical realism rather than melodrama, the series positioned itself as a grounded genre drama with global appeal, proving that tone, not replication, is what allows adaptations to travel. A similar evolution defined Weak Hero Class 2, which demonstrated that successful adaptation is not only about preservation, but progression. Instead of repeating familiar action beats, the series deepened its psychological stakes, allowing the franchise to mature alongside its audience and solidify itself as a global intellectual property rather than a one-season phenomenon. Even within traditional broadcasting, SBS's Taxi Driver showed that longevity remains possible when a webtoon-based series resists stagnation, choosing instead to reframe its moral questions with each season, rather than treating repetition as reliability. Across these successes, a clear pattern emerged. Every adaptation that worked solved at least one problem: format, tone, or audience expansion, and often all three. The failures of 2025 exposed what happens when none of those problems are addressed. The most visible example was Omniscient Reader, a project that illustrated how budget, casting, and visual ambition cannot compensate for structural incompatibility between story and medium. The original web novel thrives on complexity, layered world-building, and long-term narrative accumulation, yet the decision to compress that scope into a single feature film produced a story that felt simultaneously overwhelming and shallow, too dense for new viewers, and too stripped down for loyal fans. Here, scale was not the issue. Compression was. Netflix's Mercy for None encountered a different failure, one rooted not in structure, but in tone. While the series initially drew attention, longtime readers criticized the adaptation for smoothing out the moral roughness and narrative discomfort that defined the original webtoon, replacing it with safer, more familiar action drama rhythms. In attempting to broaden appeal, the series diluted the very identity that made the IP valuable in the first place. Channel A's The Witch struggled for yet another reason, revealing how quickly audience expectations have shifted. Its slow burn pacing and atmospheric buildup, once hallmarks of prestige Korean dramas, felt increasingly out of sync with a viewing culture shaped by global competition, binge consumption, and compressed attention spans. These projects were not poorly made. They were made for the wrong moment, or the wrong medium. This is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The lesson of 2025 is not that webtoon adaptations are failing, nor that their dominance is fading, but that the industry's easiest shortcut has stopped working. Adaptation is no longer a protective layer against risk. It is a responsibility that demands structural clarity, tonal integrity, and a deep understanding of how illustrated imagination must change when translated into cinematic language. As Studio N leadership has previously emphasized, success lies not in ownership of popular stories, but in discovering the right visual grammar, one that preserves meaning without overwhelming or flattening it. In today's K-content ecosystem, recognition no longer guarantees resonance. Execution does, and in 2025, that distinction became impossible to ignore.